A very warm welcome on this bright and sunny morning, and we are going to be in conversation, Oren and I. And before we go into conversation, I just thought I'd give you a framework for this morning. So we'll talk for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then I thought it'd be good to open the floor to Oren for questions, as that's a good kind of format that we can kind of, if there's a few questions you'd like to hear about or expand upon, or just your own voice to connect, we really welcome that. So that's the format for the In Conversation. So I am really honoured to be in conversation with Oren today, and I would like to take this opportunity to first thank the gallery, Adele, Asante, and thank Charlie, Berta, everybody in the gallery, and Jeremy, that have been really supportive in welcoming Oren's work, and also very much this sense of exploration with an artist's work, be it from producing the work to actually connecting to the audience. So really grateful for that. I want to now start with Oren, so I'm really grateful to connect because we met about, I don't know, this summer?
It was spring, yeah. Spring. When I was at Ksenia, so that's maybe April or May.
Yeah, I remember it was the crocuses were just coming up. And I was first struck by the sense of immense beauty of the work and to kind of so I wanted to find out more about Oren. So I looked up, and just to let you know, for those that you don't know his work, so Oren was born in 1985 in Tel Aviv, lives and works in New York, and very much his education has stemmed from masters at Yale University and then taught at the University of Pennsylvania. Notably, shows include the ICA in Philadelphia, and then that brought me to looking at Uriel Mostin last summer. Huge show, great success, called False Alarm. And that's the start of our conversation, which this show was inspired as a departure from False Alarm and the totemic structures that echoed a sense of mourning. So I'm going to put my first question to you. So False Alarm in Wales, in Uriel Mostin, can you tell us about how that idea of mourning kind of worked with these pieces and new constructions of these sculptures?
Yeah. Okay.
Not hard questions. Sorry, break them in easy.
I guess so. You'll have to forgive me for probably every question. I'll go back a few steps to be able to start talking about the specific question. So I would say I'll start maybe with the title and the logic of describing the work as work that was produced under that logic of mourning. So to expand further, the idea of thinking about mourning was for me, the tendency is to think about a personal mourning, which is not excluding that, and I think that structure is similar in some ways to larger structures in society, but I was more interested in thinking about mourning as a suggestion to acknowledge moments in which the structures that sort of hold society together, or that allow us to communicate with each other, allow us to live with a certain agreement of protecting each other. There are moments, I think, in history, and I think that we are, for a while, in moments that we're seeing more and more structures like that sort of break down. And I guess the suggestion was to carve a space or to slow down and to sort of try to think about the construction of objects. It's like if you want to go bigger, like even the approach to architecture, or just generally building our environment in which we have a relationship of co-creation. We make things and they sort of determine how we live and how we sleep, how we eat. And so to sort of think about a slowing down, allow things to sort of be built with certain sense of fragility, of the ambiguity of bodies, And so there are ways in which I'll describe maybe a little later. There are specific formal elements in the work, and also the material, sand, that has to do with this expression of mourning rituals, and just also depictions of, mourners in sculpture. And but I guess I'll just maybe tell you, going back a bit more. So I'm always working with a certain, in my mind, it's a construction principle. So, the body of works before I started to work with sand as this primary material, had to do more with a logic that with time I developed the name of erotic construction, which briefly I'll describe the logic. So if you imagine an erotic situation between two people, in order for it to be, let's say, a successful erotic encounter, there needs to be a certain loss of boundaries between self and other, between the two bodies, ideally some exchange of, body liquids, or a certain kind of porosity, let's say, of both spiritually but also physically. And so thinking about that as sort of a logic for construction, so imagining architecture and the categories, in the work, the categories of landscape, body, vegetation, furniture, architecture, they all sort of merge into these hybridic structures or environments that I think, for me, are sort of about creating those fluid environments in which, things are this and this and this, and potentially sort of confronting you with a certain vulnerability of your own body, of your own mortality, and maybe, sort of, I'm trying not to talk too in a grandiose way, but that is the motive for the work. It's always related to architecture, but also just the structures that we live in and we're participating in, and we, in many ways, are responsible for. But so that was sort of, it was following a certain interest in looking at the way, modernism had a lot of utopian projects where architects and poets and thinkers generally were sort of daring to imagine how society could look like, but it also failed for many good reasons, for the way it was excluding many types of identities and structures of power that were sort of trying to literally, like, I don't know, bring the world down to the greed logic, and those things failed. But at the same time, I think there was a certain gap created in people generally, and creative people specifically, like daring to think in a constructive way. It sort of was perceived as maybe like aggressive or macho, and at the same time, I think into that gap, I felt like this is where the supremacy of, like, technology and the algorithm comes in, and the beginning of the rise of more like fascistic tendencies in politics. I think those things are finding their place in the gap where we stop imagining or stop, thinking that we do have the place or the responsibility to participate in the imagination of how things can look like. And so I mean, I think naturally with it was around COVID where I had to have a show in New York. I knew that I had this show scheduled with Helena and rather gallery in New York, and like so many people, I was depressed somewhat. It was one of the first, maybe the first or second lockdowns in New York, and I wasn't really questioning whether I want to make art. It was clear to me that that's what I do, and I believe in it. But it was a question of how to make it, and like how, and is the work that I was making so far still makes sense to me. And there was something very like lush and on the verge of utopianism, and it just seemed not like. At the one hand, I was like, well, it's more important than ever to like have that faith, but at the same time, I was like, well, but also something is knocking on the door, and something is exposed.
I think in that knock, which
Yes.
is what I saw.
Stop it, please.
No, but that knock to kind of that knock, which I think to round it is to show that throughout the history of art, the notion of mourning as a kind of way into balance the monumentality of death and life and rebirth, and also the mundane. And I think that's something your work does kind of balance between the mundane and the monumentality. But mourning, to go back to, because it's a very, obviously there's, we talked about the effigies of history of art, that there's influences in your work when you see these amazing sculptures upstairs from Baroque, Mannerism, that, to Utopianism, but the whole, there's a kind of whole iconography of understanding these works, but mourning as a kind of rebirth or a departure point to look at these set of emotions or a set of renewal. And I think that's what I really connect to your work and love, that there's a sense of hope, that mourning doesn't have to be a death and a finitude that's gone, that actually it opens to a potentiality. So can you tell us about mourning, and like even one of your works has that title?
Yeah, it's definitely not, for me, the focus is not on the like, it's not on grief, let's say, because it's a recognition of the fact that there is a breakage, there is a tear in what we maybe didn't notice or was more unified before in the way that things just work in society and the structure we live by, and sort of recognizing it, and then also, yes, like it's supposed to be sort of a force or a logic of metamorphosis, or allowing things to be built or rebuilt in ways that maybe you believe in more, that are more in line with what I believe is the true nature of things, which is fragility, co-creation, and so the works are made out of sand, and I think maybe I'll say something about that because it's very directly related. And so, can I go back to that story of?
Yeah, you can.
Sorry. No, but it does bring us to the materials. So, I was walking Washington Square Park, and it was a snowstorm, and people were building this like snowman, or sort of. Some were actually looking like snowmen. Some were more abstract erections, and I remember seeing it, and first seeing the kind of joy that people had from doing this very basic thing of erecting something from the ground. And it just sort of struck me, because I was first feeling, I want that, I want my job, or like the next few months when I'm working on this show, to feel like that. And so it brought me into this back into this very basic principle in sculpture, which is this primordial human need to manipulate matter, and so I thought, well, maybe that's the place to start, and then I thought about, I imagine this room with the floor full of sand and these columns coming up, but then I was of course thinking, well, it's maybe too primordial, too simple, and I wanted some of the subjects of my work to be in it, but I thought about sand as this material that has a lot of contradictions, that we perceive as contradictions, but they're not, which is, it's at the same time the mythic material that we're told to be created from, and so it has in it creativity, it has the ability to manipulate matter, but it's also the product and the agent of erosion. It's what we will become, one day, and so I think for me that the material, and sort of an overlooked material, and I think obviously it's a construction material as well, and a declining resource. And so there are just a lot in any material, but in this case sand, it holds this tension between decline, like the sort of real, but also sort of those images of the decline of a society, the like edifices or statues of a society buried under the dunes. But it does also have that sort of call for playfulness or porousness or fragility, um,
And arising from that, these sculptures, which are the totemic figures, they have a sheltering embodiment to you, but they also have a confrontation. I think if you look up, we'll take you back up in it later, look at the feet, it's all like claws, that they're on these rocks and they're like holding with their life. They're not going to let go. But to me, your sculptures have this presence, and the sense of scale is important. Why are they towering over us? Can you talk about the feet and the tower?
Yeah. So the feet is actually a detail that is taken, sort of was inspired by, I'm sure all of you have seen before, medieval tombs. They have the effigy on top, and often you have the figure sort of having their feet wrapped around like a little pillow or a dog. And I remember seeing it, and at first not thinking about it, but then there was a moment that I was like, wait, why is there tension in the feet? Why is it sort of curled if it's a dead body? And then I thought, oh well, the effigy is already an immortalization of the ephemeral body, and so maybe that tension in the feet is sort of the exact point of tension between verticality and horizontality, or life and death. And so immediately I sort of saw the whole figure vertical, and I really liked that sort of precarious position, or like grabbing onto the rock, and it's something that I think it's both as an image, but also formally or physically, to make these sculptures stand in this way is one of the hardest point of making these sculptures.
So you talked about the frustration with the material, that they're so rigid. And then how you use burlap. You actually did it with your hands, like constructing the spine. Can you tell us why you want that flexibility with that material, or that vulnerability?
Yeah, I mean, I think that generally I believe in like as much as possible working with the qualities that are already embedded in the materials and the knowledge we have of those things. It's like if I decide on the height of something, I do think about, if it's a doorknob, where is it hitting my body, or if it's a reception window, if it's the opening of the reception window, so to try to evoke feelings that has to do with life. And so
and that sense of scale as well, I just want to
connect that. And I looked at your work too, because it has that sense of human. So you connect to the window, the door, or our bodies are towering over. And it reminds me of Mark Manders, who I worked with previously, and Mark very much does the sculptures, which has an eerie sense like yours. He has half a cat chopped up. You point out Mark Manders, those that don't see the really interesting answers that questions our world, our place in the world, but almost like a twilight constellation of other world, which I think very much connects to your practice. And Mark, which I think is very similar to you create these private lounges. Like these sculptures are made up on your private languages, that, we could have a household object connected to something from the landscape, connected to something from a future world, that's sci-fi landscapes. These alternative architectures, like we talked about with the pavilions, you're creating these worlds, entering these zones. Like Mark, how did this language come about? Was this when you were small? Did you sketch and create these languages?
Well, first, thank you for the compliment. I do love his work. I guess it would be hard for me to say exactly like what's the origin of it, but but it is, I mean, it is very much like, I would say, private in the sense that there is an inner language to the work where like, you know, a bump or a hole is repeating through different objects and sort of slowly is fixing itself as something with meaning. So, you know, it can be a set of holes that are eyes and mouth, but they're also genitals and the lack of genitals, and they can be breasts and penises, or they can be an architectural opening or an organic one. So through repetition in the work itself and through the practice, I think I'm trying to establish a language, and in that sense, and that language is connected to constantly to life, and but of course there is also imagination in it, and
And when you say sexuality, because it's very much the queerness of the artworks, when you place it in sculpture, it doesn't quite sit or fit or retain a space, which is good. It really pushes out, and you need a revisionist sense of how we look at sculpture and why. So the queerness has a sexuality that I think is very seductive. Your works kind of pull you in, but it's an exchange. Can you tell me when you were doing whole, that idea of the exchange, or the idea of the, you know, the connection, the porosity?
Yeah. Yeah, I can maybe talk about that work and the title. But maybe I'll say something very brief about this question of you know, queerness. It's a term that I am personally always trying to talk through other words about it, but I would say that it is for me this like it's an attempt to create a logic and an experience. It's a logic for the creation of the work, but also hopefully an experience for the viewers and viewers' body, which has to do with that sort of like porosity between the categories that construct the work of architecture and body and vegetation and furniture, and in different ways also confront you with maybe your own ephemerality or mortality, maybe with, and there are moments that are more directly referencing, you know, the body, or like bodily cavities and sexuality. Sometimes in previous work there were actual, you know, environments that you could think of as a garden, or that something has to do with cruising. There's the Vaseline on the glass, and all of those. I have works with the urinals, and so that subject was dealt with more directly as a subject, but mostly I'm interested in it as this space where bodies are ambiguous, where there is fragility, vulnerability, and so that for me is, I mean, for me, queerness is like the ability to hold like differences, or to hold like it's an uncomfortable space, but it's also it's about that sort of porosity and co-creation. So trying to be in one hand in a vulnerable, fragile place, but at the same time not giving up like the ambition for like imagination and so. But specifically, let's just take the title, for example. And I don't know how much it's directly connected to this subject, but it's a maybe opportunity to talk about also just titles generally in the work. So the work with, so it's this like taller work with a set of holes and then a sort of container at the top, a perforated container that looks a little bit like a colander. And so that piece is titled, it's a bit hard to say it, but it's hole with W, so hole, and so, you know, just generally language is important for me in the work, both to create a language through the forms, but also the use of the language we are using. And again, it's like using the familiar to sort of transgress it and to create experiences around those transgressions. And so specifically that title, for me, what I like is, so if you think about the word whole with an H and whole with a W, they both describe basically pretty similar things that we're having a hard time to express or to explain through language. And so in a sense, they're like two sides of the same coin, but also linguistically, what separates them is just the letter W. And so when you look at the title, it's also sort of a mirror structure. So whole, 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 whole. And I think I like what it does to your mouth when you say it. You know, it's like, it's sort of, it's almost like a tongue tie title, but it's involving your mouth in a way that, for example, for me, that's sexual. I mean, it's sort of consuming the work, obviously the words. It's like, it is like impossible to say whole without also thinking about the sexual or bodily, at least, nature of it. And yeah, and so it was this way because the cavities in my work are always this place that the categories are like very, very thin. You know, the borders between them, like it's eyes, but it's also genitals. It's also breasts, the lack of breasts. Sometimes it's a window, and depending on the work. So yeah.
And from that kind of sense of desire and exchange is something that I really love about your work too, that it bursts with life, like Babel, but also it reminds us of nature and vegetation, of the natural landscape. And if you look at the constructions, they are very much like, ecomorphic or natural. And I'm reminded here of Ruth Asawa. So Ruth Asawa, a great sculptor who very interestingly started off her work with just one thread. And she was inspired by basket weaving and also the spider's web, and very much reflective of patterns from nature. That I think there's a coding and there's a patternation that also underplays and overplays in your work. Of you take vegetation and nature, and I think it's very much, you connect that in, infuse that in your work. I mean, how important is nature to you?
Very. I think I'll try to answer it through again going back a little bit and just explaining the process or the journey that the practice, because I sort of work in a cumulative logic versus shifting subjects, and when I moved to the US about 13 years ago, and in school, in grad school, I remember, I used to have work that was primarily wood, and it was these pavilions that looked like a marriage between furniture and architecture, but they had this very heavy, like sort of neo-minimal logic to them, and I remember, starting with what I knew, but very quickly realizing that people don't really connect with it there. And I remember, it was a process for me to understand why, and to also recognize changes in me. And I remember a studio visit with Leslie Dick, who's a writer and an artist who was visiting at the time at Yale, and she told me something like, "Oh, what do you want? This work is so much about like death and moralization and like peeing, and it's like all of those things that Americans don't really want to look at. It's just like it's just like maybe just think about that." And I was like, "Huh, okay." But then I think I also started to ask myself questions about my own identity, my own sexuality, and more I think I was also frustrated with the rigid logic of working with wood in the way that I did. You just have to measure and then cut and then joint, and then I thought about the geometry of it, and the sort of hierarchical. If you think about foundations of a building, like a modern foundation would be a floor, a column, a floor, a column. So there is a hierarchy, versus like a geodesic dome, or like Gothic arches, where the logic of support is very different. Like in a geodesic dome, each point supports the other point. And so I started to think about, the aesthetics or geometries of my work in relation to also how they made me feel. and started to see some connections, for example, between minimalism and militarism. And I'll just briefly give two examples. And it's maybe like, you could think about it in so many other ways, but for me, when I all of a sudden could not see, like, for example, when you look at the Richard Serra, and then like the wall, in Israel, between Israel and Palestine, or like a bombed house and like a Gordon Matta Clark. I don't know. I was just struck by, like, I was like, huh, these things do look a lot like each other, and so I started to think more and more about some connections between the geometry we're using and the kind of histories that they're connected to and perpetuate in maybe some ways. And so and it's not to say, because it could be also a simplistic way to read it. So, because it's not that, for example, if we build the world as a geodesic domes, we won't have like violence, So it's not as simple, obviously, but it did make me go back to periods like the Gothic and just principles, for example, like how vegetation and structure are like one there, and sort of try to think about the ways that there's relationship of sympathy between things, of things designing other things. And so that's sort of how the geometry changed, and also the respect and thought, or sort of like humble position towards natural structures and principles. And so that was the origin of it. And I think in this work, besides the use of sand and rock in relation to these ideas of time, of life and death, I think that the title After Pleasure is sort of is again this dual thing, where it's both recognizing our inability not to be after pleasure. It's a natural tendency of all of us to, if you're alive, you're in some ways constantly, pursuing satisfaction, pleasure, and at the same time, it's sort of recognizing that constant hunger, and in a way we're like sort of eating the world we're living in, consuming it, it has a finite nature in some ways. Resources are depleting, like our bodies are ephemeral, and so it's an attempt to, and which I think I'm only starting to do here, which to try to think, can I think about the logic for construction of objects, imagining a world after pleasure, but in that sense, again, it's because we can't actually be post pleasure, but something that maybe gives attention to that relationship of consuming, of and maybe that does mean putting the human in a place that is more in line with our actual dependency on the environment and on other people, and so that takes different forms, and it's not only nature. Like, for example, there is another piece called You and Me Without You, and it's the one with the like large cavity in the center pole, and that one has a personal story, I guess, for the title, that did have to do with an end of a relationship, and sort of recognizing how when you lose someone, there are still with you. It sounds like a cliche, but yes, I mean the way, and it did make me think about it more generally, also as if we can imagine people as almost like an organ inside of us versus a reflection, or something that's out there that we have a relationship of. If we're kind enough, then maybe I tolerate this person, but it still means something about my own ego and my own perception of myself, versus realizing that everything outside is also inside. It's also like
I think that sense of a proposition, I mean, when I encounter your work, I feel that you're giving many propositions. And I was reminded, we talked about earlier, Mike Kelly, the idea of the proposition and how Mike, does his works through sculptures, through film, video, and drawings. There's a proposition. And I think something we talked about is your drawings too. And I wonder, are they a secret proposition or do they connect the final piece?
My drawings are, for the most part, I don't show them, just because, it's almost for me like, because the process is usually starting with a lot of hours of reading, daydreaming, like some forms of meditation, and then many, many, many sketches and drawings. And a lot of them, I get that question often, because when people see them, they're like, oh, it's great, let's see them, with the work. And there are two parts for it. One is that they do feel like vulnerable in the sense that, it's like my handwriting is like it looks like a 3-year-old, handwriting, and my drawings are sort of like that. But I think that the other side of it is that, which is why I brought up Mike Kelly. It's like when I saw, it was a retrospective of his work in Piece 1 a few years ago, and there was a room that was only the drawings and like notebooks, and I remember being so like moved by how a lot of these, seeing the drawing was enough for me. Like I almost didn't need the work, and so I think that part for me, because I think like some drawings actually capture an essence of a proposition, because I think in his work there's also this imagination of objects that are trying to touch this, like, I don't know, fragility of our like bodies and like existence in some speculative ways or imaginative ways. And so in that sense, seeing the drawing or like the like almost, it's like architectural plans, but with some meat, like not as removed. So maybe I don't know, maybe I'm afraid that will be enough. But
maybe one day.
Yes.
And as we enter your world of post-pleasure, where in that world that, I think we're living in times of conflict, pandemics, war crisis, that, it's in that world of overconsumption, of use of the internet, the material, that there's a world that it's not a kind of an apocalyptic world. It may be a world of renewal or different possibility. I think your works offer us different potentials, different stories to tell, different connections. So, I want to thank you for a beautiful show. And on that end as well, I was going to say, I do feel there's an overriding element of hopefulness, that also questioning, that balance of your work is really important, that tension. So I'm really grateful to encounter that too. And just say anything else for you on that sense of post-pleasure that you feel comes to the work.
Yeah, well, I guess I can say two separate things. One is still about the work, which is, the title did come in a moment that I was like starting to recognize that I was like, maybe, do I experience pleasure? Like, is it still in my life? Is it still a thing that I experience in day to day? And I wasn't sure. And I think I started to think about it more and more, and how I think that again, the structures that allowed us for a period of time, of course, very differently from person to person, place to place, but at least, where I was, which is in New York and the West, I guess, allowed us to experience a degree of pleasure, a degree of freedom, and I guess I started to feel like those, we're consuming the principles and the structures that allowed us to have that, or in a sense, even if you think about it as like, I don't know, the logic of addiction, when there is too much of something, the flavor is starting to get dissolved. And so so I think it started as a very like real, just like feeling or question with myself, and then I just thought more and more, about could it be a way to think hopefully or creatively or imaginatively about the making of objects. But I do think that it's important for me to say, that it's like I think it's very important to believe in the power of like imagination, and it's like when you are making a law that changes people's lives immediately, it's easy to see that effect. And when you write a book, a philosophy book, or you're doing something in the creative fields, it's much harder to see the effect of it on society. But we sometimes say about something like, oh, this is Freudian, or this is Kantian, or and so I think in some ways we do have an effect, and in that sense I think that the hope is important. But at the same time, looking at the very real many crises, I think for me personally, I do separate my civil obligations and the things that when it's necessary to demonstrate, when it's necessary to help people, when it's necessary to donate, or whatever you feel like you can do in the face of like very, like harsh realities. And maybe I'll say something more specific about it in a second. But so yeah, so I think because the conversation is also touching those questions about life, I think it's maybe important for me to also say, I think, there is often a tendency, even when you think about it, identity, the way identity politics is like often in work, it's like, I do think that we are part of our works, and like our practice is so much influenced by who we are and our life experience. But at the same time, I think it's important for me to remember also the like things that you can't do through art, and the responsibility that we have, to those things that can't be said and can't be approached directly through the work. But thank you for. I mean, it's it's very touching to hear that. So.